Director David Johnson checked his watch as he drove through the quiet streets of Pine Valley, Georgia. The small town looked peaceful in the afternoon sun, with its old brick buildings and tree-lined streets. He was running a few minutes late for his speaking engagement at the local police academy, but nothing too serious. The GPS on his dashboard showed another 15 minutes to his destination. David had been looking forward to this visit. As the head of the FBI, he rarely got the chance to speak directly to new police recruits in small towns like this one. These were the officers who would serve their communities for decades, and David believed in the importance of building bridges between federal and local law enforcement. His black sedan was unmarked but clearly government-issued. Anyone who knew cars could tell it was official just by looking at it. David wore his usual dark suit and tie, the kind of professional attire that marked him as someone important. His briefcase sat on the passenger seat, filled with notes for his presentation about community policing and building trust. The drive had been pleasant so far. David enjoyed these trips outside of Washington. They reminded him why he'd gotten into law enforcement in the first place, back when he was a young agent walking a beat in Detroit. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, but the principles he'd learned then still guided him today. As he turned onto Main Street, David noticed a police car parked at the corner. The officer inside seemed to be watching traffic, probably doing routine patrol work. David gave a small wave as he passed, a gesture of professional courtesy from one law enforcement officer to another. What David didn't see was the way Officer Brad Morrison's eyes followed his car. Morrison had been having a rough month. His arrest numbers were down, and his sergeant had made it clear that the department needed to show results in their ongoing drug enforcement campaign. The pressure was getting to him, and he'd been looking for opportunities to make arrests that would impress his superiors. When Morrison saw the black sedan with its out-of-state plates, something clicked in his mind. The car looked expensive, and the driver appeared to be African American. In Morrison's limited worldview, this combination meant only one thing: drug dealer. He'd made assumptions like this before, and they'd sometimes led to arrests that boosted his statistics. Morrison pulled out from his parking spot and began following David's car at a distance. He watched as the sedan maintained a steady legal speed and followed all traffic rules. The driver was being careful, maybe too careful. To Morrison, this cautious driving looked suspicious rather than responsible. David, meanwhile, was completely unaware he was being followed. He was thinking about his presentation, mentally reviewing the key points he wanted to make to the recruits. He'd planned to talk about the importance of treating every citizen with respect, regardless of their background. It was a message he felt strongly about, especially given his own experiences growing up in a tough neighborhood. The radio in Morrison's patrol car crackled with routine traffic updates. Dispatch was quiet this afternoon, which meant Morrison was free to pursue what he saw as a promising lead. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, even when those instincts were based more on prejudice than actual police work. As they reached the outskirts of town, Morrison decided to make his move. He flipped on his lights and siren, the familiar wail cutting through the quiet afternoon air. In his rear-view mirror, David saw the flashing lights and felt his heart sink slightly. He'd been driving carefully and knew he hadn't broken any traffic laws, but he also knew what these stops could turn into. David pulled over onto the shoulder of the road, a stretch of asphalt bordered by pine trees on both sides. He turned off his engine and placed his hands clearly on the steering wheel, a position he'd maintained during the few traffic stops he'd experienced over the years. Even as FBI director, he understood the dynamics of these encounters and the importance of not making any sudden movements. Morrison approached the car with his hand resting on his service weapon, a gesture that was both standard procedure and intimidation tactic. He walked slowly, taking his time to build tension. This was his show now, and he wanted to make sure the driver understood who was in control. When Morrison reached the driver's window, David had already rolled it down and was waiting with his license ready. But Morrison barely glanced at the offered document. Instead, he was focused on studying David's face and the interior of the car, looking for any sign of criminal activity. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the authority he'd practiced in front of his bedroom mirror as a rookie. David remained calm and polite. "No, sir, I don't believe I was speeding or violating any traffic laws." Morrison didn't like the answer, In his experience, guilty people usually tried to explain themselves or make excuses. This calm, measured response felt like defiance to him. "I've been following you for the past few miles," Morrison said, which wasn't entirely true. "Your driving seemed erratic. You were weaving slightly and driving unusually slow." David knew this was false, but he also knew that arguing with an officer during a traffic stop rarely improved the situation. "I apologize if my driving appeared concerning, officer. I was simply being careful on roads I'm not familiar with." The politeness in David's voice only irritated Morrison further. He'd expected nervousness, maybe some stammering or obvious signs of guilt. This composed response felt like a challenge to his authority. Morrison finally took David's license. But instead of running it through the system immediately, he held on to it while he continued his questioning. "Where are you headed today?" "I'm speaking at the police academy here in town," David replied honestly. Morrison's eyebrows went up. This wasn't the answer he'd expected. "What kind of speaking?" "You some kind of lawyer?" "I work in law enforcement," David said simply. This response intrigued Morrison but also made him more suspicious. In his mind, a black man claiming to work in law enforcement was probably lying, possibly trying to impersonate an officer or create some kind of false authority. "What department?" Morrison pressed. David hesitated for just a moment. He could reveal his position, but experience had taught him that some officers reacted poorly to federal authority. He decided to keep things simple for now. "Federal level," he said. Morrison's suspicion deepened. This whole situation was starting to feel like a setup to him. A well-dressed black man in an expensive car, claiming to work for the federal government, driving through his small town. Everything about it screamed drug dealer trying to appear legitimate. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Morrison said, his hand moving closer to his weapon. David's heart rate increased slightly, but his expression remained calm. He understood that this stop was about to escalate, and he needed to be very careful about how he handled the next few minutes. David stepped out of his car slowly and deliberately, keeping his hands visible at all times. He'd been through situations like this before, though never while serving as FBI director. The hot Georgia sun beat down on the asphalt as he stood beside his vehicle, waiting for Morrison's next instruction. Morrison walked around the car, studying it from different angles. The sedan was clearly government-issued, with its sturdy build and subtle modifications that most people wouldn't notice. But Morrison wasn't really looking at those details. His mind was already made up about what kind of person he was dealing with. "Turn around and place your hands on the roof of the car," Morrison commanded. David complied without question. He felt Morrison's hands patting him down, checking for weapons or contraband. The search was thorough but professional, and Morrison found nothing except David's phone, wallet, and a small notebook he always carried. "What's this?" Morrison asked, flipping through the notebook. "Work notes," David replied simply. The notebook contained mostly administrative reminders and meeting notes, nothing that would seem unusual to most people. But Morrison's paranoid mindset made him see potential code words and suspicious abbreviations in David's handwriting. Morrison stuffed the notebook into his pocket and continued his inspection. He walked around to the passenger side of the car and peered through the windows, looking for anything that might justify his growing suspicion that this stop would lead to a significant arrest. "I'm detecting a strong odor of marijuana coming from your vehicle," Morrison announced loudly. David's eyebrows rose slightly. He'd never used drugs in his life, and his car was regularly detailed and inspected as part of his security protocols. There was no possible way his vehicle could smell like marijuana. "Officer, I can assure you that's not possible," David said calmly. "I don't use drugs, and this vehicle is regularly inspected." Morrison's jaw tightened. The calm denial felt like mockery to him. In his experience, everyone denied drug possession, but they usually did it with obvious nervousness or anger. This measured response was different, and it unsettled him. "Well, I'm going to have to search the vehicle to investigate the source of that odor," Morrison said. David knew he had no choice but to consent. Refusing would only escalate the situation further, and he was confident that any search would turn up nothing because there was nothing to find. "You have my permission to search the vehicle, officer," David said. Morrison opened the driver's side door and began his search. He started with the obvious places: the glove compartment, center console, and door pockets. Everything was neat and organized, exactly what you'd expect from a federal employee's car. Morrison found David's registration and insurance papers, all properly filed and up to date. The briefcase on the passenger seat caught Morrison's attention. He opened it and found presentation materials, including a folder marked Community Policing Strategies and another labeled Building Trust Between Law Enforcement and Communities. For a moment, Morrison felt a flicker of doubt about his assumptions, but that doubt quickly faded as his desperation to make an arrest grew stronger. Morrison had been under pressure from his sergeant for weeks. His arrest numbers were the lowest in his unit, and he'd been warned that his performance needed to improve. This stop represented an opportunity he couldn't afford to waste. Morrison reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag containing white powder. He'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity. The bag was small enough to suggest personal use rather than dealing, which meant it would likely result in a simple possession charge rather than something more serious that might be scrutinized too closely. David remained standing by the side of the road, his hands still visible and his posture non-threatening. He was growing concerned about how long this stop was taking, but he also understood that patience was his best strategy in this situation. Morrison positioned himself so that his body blocked David's view of the car's interior. He glanced around to make sure no other vehicles were approaching on the quiet road. The spot he'd chosen for this stop was perfect, isolated enough that there were no witnesses, but still close enough to town that backup would arrive quickly if needed. With practiced movements, Morrison slipped the plastic bag under the driver's seat, pushing it far enough back that it would look like someone had tried to hide it, but not so far that it would be difficult to discover during his search. Morrison then moved to the back seat area, making a show of searching thoroughly. He checked under the seats, in the door pockets, and behind the cushions. His movements were deliberate and loud, creating the impression of a thorough professional search. Well, Morrison said suddenly, his voice carrying a tone of false surprise. What do we have here? David turned his head slightly, trying to see what Morrison was referring to. From his position beside the car, he couldn't see into the interior clearly. Morrison reached under the driver's seat and pulled out the plastic bag, holding it up so David could see it. Care to explain this? David's eyes widened in genuine shock. Officer, I've never seen that before in my life. That's not mine. Morrison smiled grimly. This was the reaction he'd expected all along. That's what they all say. This appears to be cocaine, about 2 grams worth. David's mind raced. He understood immediately what had happened, but he also knew that explaining it would be nearly impossible. Who would believe that a police officer had planted drugs in an FBI director's car, even if people eventually accepted the truth? The immediate situation was extremely dangerous. Officer, I'm telling you the truth, David said, maintaining his calm tone despite the seriousness of what was happening. I work for the federal government. I undergo regular drug testing. That substance does not belong to me. Morrison stood up and walked around to face David directly. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. David felt the cold metal of handcuffs closing around his wrists. The reality of the situation hit him fully. He was being arrested on false charges by a corrupt police officer who had no idea who he was dealing with. You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance, Morrison announced officially. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Morrison continued reading David his rights while walking him toward the patrol car. David listened to the familiar words he'd heard officers recite thousands of times throughout his career. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now on the receiving end of the process he'd dedicated his life to upholding. As Morrison opened the back door of his patrol car, David made one more attempt to reason with him. Officer, I really think you should check my identification more carefully. There might be some information there that would change your perspective on this situation. Morrison laughed. Nice try, but I've heard every story in the book. Rich guys like you think you can talk your way out of anything. David settled into the back seat of the patrol car, his mind already working through the implications of what was happening. Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of his career, but David knew it would take time for that reality to become clear. Morrison called in his arrest over the radio, reporting that he'd apprehended a suspect for drug possession during a routine traffic stop. The dispatcher acknowledged his report and advised that a tow truck would be sent to impound David's vehicle. As they drove toward the police station, Morrison felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in weeks. This arrest would definitely improve his statistics and show his superiors that he was still an effective officer. He had no idea that he'd just set in motion a chain of events that would destroy his career and expose a pattern of corruption that had been hidden for years. The Pine Valley Police Department was a modest building that housed about 20 officers serving the small community. Morrison pulled into the parking lot feeling confident about his arrest. He'd radioed ahead that he was bringing in a drug possession suspect, and he could see a few of his colleagues gathering near the entrance, curious about his latest catch. David remained calm in the back seat. Though his mind was racing through the implications of what was happening, he'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that false arrests happened. But experiencing one firsthand was different than reading about it in reports. The handcuffs felt tight around his wrists, and the back seat of the patrol car smelled like industrial cleaning solution mixed with fear and regret from countless previous passengers. Morrison parked and came around to open David's door. "Watch your head," he said with mock courtesy as he helped David out of the vehicle. Several officers had gathered to watch the proceedings. Word had already spread through the small department that Morrison had made an arrest, and everyone was curious to see what he'd brought in. These small-town arrests didn't happen every day, especially drug cases that might make the local news. "What do we got, Morrison?" asked Sergeant Pete Wilson, a 20-year veteran who supervised the patrol division. "Drug possession," Morrison replied proudly. "Found about 2 grams of cocaine hidden under his seat during a traffic stop." Sergeant Wilson looked David up and down, taking in his expensive suit and professional appearance. Something didn't feel right about this arrest, but he trusted Morrison's judgment. The young officer had been struggling lately, and Wilson was glad to see him making arrests again. Morrison led David through the front doors of the station and toward the booking area. The department's day shift was in full swing, with officers coming and going, phones ringing, and the usual controlled chaos of a busy police station. Behind the main desk sat Officer Lisa Chen, who handled booking and intake procedures. She'd been with the department for 8 years and had processed hundreds of arrests. She looked up as Morrison approached with his suspect. "What's the charge?" Chen asked, pulling out the necessary paperwork. "Possession of a controlled substance," Morrison replied. "Cocaine, about 2 grams. Chen studied David's appearance and demeanor. Like Sergeant Wilson, she felt something was off about this arrest. The suspect was too calm, too well-dressed, and too articulate for a typical drug user. But she'd learned not to question her colleague's judgment unless there was a clear problem. "I need to make my phone call," David said quietly. Morrison laughed. "You'll get your phone call when we're ready to give it to you. First, we need to get you processed and into a cell." David knew his rights, but he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. He remained patient while Chen began filling out the booking paperwork. She asked for his basic information. Name, address, occupation. "David Johnson," he replied to her first question. "Address?" David gave his home address in Washington, D.C., which raised Chen's eyebrows slightly. It wasn't unusual for out-of-state visitors to get arrested, but most of them weren't wearing $1,000 suits. "Occupation?" Chen asked. David hesitated for a moment. He could lie and make something up, but that would only complicate things later. "Federal law enforcement," he said simply. Morrison snorted. "Yeah, right. That's what they all claim." Chen looked up from her paperwork. "What agency?" "FBI," David replied. The room went quiet for a moment. Chen's pen stopped moving, and even Morrison's confident expression faltered slightly, but his skepticism quickly returned. "Sure you are," Morrison said, "and I'm the chief of police." Chen continued with her questions, but David could tell she was taking his claims more seriously than Morrison was. When she asked for his identification, David directed her to his wallet, which Morrison had confiscated during the search. Morrison reluctantly handed over the wallet, still convinced that whatever ID David carried would be fake or stolen. Chen opened it and pulled out David's driver's license. She read it carefully, then looked at David, then back at the license. "This says your full name is David Robert Johnson," she said. "That's correct," David replied. Chen continued searching through the wallet and found several other pieces of identification. There was a federal building access card, a government credit card, and what appeared to be some kind of official badge credential in a leather holder. Chen opened the credential holder and her face went pale. The badge was clearly authentic with the FBI seal and David's photograph, but it was the title printed below his name that made her hands start to shake. "Morrison," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Morrison walked over, still confident but growing slightly annoyed at the delay. "What now?" Chen handed him the credential holder without saying a word. Morrison looked down at it, and his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then pure terror. The credential clearly identified David Robert Johnson as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Morrison's hands started shaking as he stared at the badge. He looked up at David, then back down at the credential, then up at David again. The color drained from his face as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. This has to be fake," Morrison stammered. Chen was already reaching for her computer keyboard. She pulled up the FBI's official website and navigated to the leadership page. There, staring back at them from the computer screen, was a professional photograph of David Robert Johnson, identified as the current director of the FBI. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same face, same build, same calm expression. Chen compared the photo on the screen to the man standing in front of her, then to the photo on the credential. They were clearly the same person. "Oh my God," Chen whispered. Sergeant Wilson had been watching from across the room and noticed the commotion. He walked over to see what was causing the problem. "What's going on here?" Wilson asked. Chen handed him the credential without speaking. Wilson looked at it, then at the computer screen, then at David. His face went ashen. "Morrison," Wilson said slowly, "do you realize what you've done?" Morrison was still staring at the credential, hoping it would somehow transform into something less terrifying. "It has to be fake," he repeated weakly. Wilson was already reaching for his phone. As a 20-year veteran, he understood the implications immediately. This wasn't just a false arrest. It was a federal incident that would bring scrutiny from the highest levels of government. "I need to call the chief," Wilson said. David finally spoke up. "Sergeant, I'd like to make my phone call now." Wilson nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Right away." Morrison was still standing there in shock, the credential hanging limply in his hands. The confident officer who had made the arrest 20 minutes earlier had been replaced by a man who looked like he was about to be sick. Chen quietly began gathering up the paperwork she'd started, realizing that none of it would be needed now. The arrest that Morrison thought would boost his career had just become the biggest mistake of his life. David remained calm throughout the chaos surrounding him. He'd been in situations before where his identity had surprised people, but never quite like this. He understood that the next few hours would be crucial in determining how this situation was resolved. "The phone is right over there, Director Johnson," Chen said, pointing to a desk across the room. As David walked toward the phone, still wearing handcuffs, every person in the police station stopped what they were doing to watch. Word was already spreading through the building that Morrison had just arrested the head of the FBI on false drug charges. Morrison slumped into a chair, the credential still in his hands as the full weight of his actions began to crush down on him. He'd planted drugs in the FBI director's car. He'd arrested the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. His career wasn't just over. His life as he knew it was about to change forever. David walked to the phone with as much dignity as possible while wearing handcuffs. The entire police station had fallen silent, with every officer and staff member watching his movements. He dialed a number he knew by heart, his deputy director's secure line. "This is Deputy Director Patricia Hayes," came the crisp, professional voice. "Patricia, it's David. I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions until I'm finished." Patricia had worked with David for 12 years. The tone in his voice immediately told her something serious was happening. "I'm currently at the Pine Valley Police Department in Georgia. I've been arrested on false drug possession charges by a local officer who planted evidence in my vehicle. I need you to make some calls." There was a pause on the other end of the line as Patricia processed what she'd just heard. "Sir, did you just say you've been arrested?" "That's correct. The officer who arrested me had no idea who I was. I need you to contact the Atlanta field office, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and the Governor's office. Also, call my security detail and tell them to stand down unless I specifically request their assistance." Patricia was already reaching for another phone while keeping David on the line. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine physically. But Patricia, This situation is about to become very complicated very quickly. I need you to handle the notifications while I deal with things here." Within minutes of David ending his call, the phones at the Pine Valley Police Department began ringing non-stop. The first call came from the FBI's Atlanta field office. Special Agent in charge. Robert Torres was on the line, and he was not happy. Chief Harold Brennan had been called in from his day off and was rushing to the station when his cell phone rang. Torres didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Chief Brennan, this is SAC Torres from the FBI Atlanta field office. I understand you have Director Johnson in custody at your facility." Chief Brennan nearly drove off the road. "Director Johnson? FBI Director Johnson?" "That's correct. I'm going to need you to release him immediately and secure all evidence related to his arrest. Do not allow anyone to leave the building who was involved in this incident." Brennan's mind was racing. How had one of his officers managed to arrest the FBI director? "Sir, I'm on my way to the station now. Can you tell me what happened?" "Your officer arrested the director on drug possession charges. The drugs were planted. This is now a federal investigation." By the time Chief Brennan arrived at the station, 3 more phone calls had come in. The U.S. Attorney's Office wanted a full briefing within the hour. The governor's office was demanding answers. And someone from the Department of Justice was driving down from Atlanta. Brennan found his officers gathered in the main area, all looking like they'd seen a ghost. Morrison was sitting at a desk with his head in his hands, while Sergeant Wilson was trying to maintain some order in the chaos. "Where is he?" Brennan asked Wilson. "Still on the phone, sir. He's been making calls for the past 20 minutes. Brennan looked around the room until he spotted David, who was speaking quietly into the phone while still wearing handcuffs. The sight made Brennan's stomach turn. The head of the FBI was in his jail, in handcuffs, because one of his officers had planted drugs. "Get those handcuffs off him right now," Brennan ordered. Wilson quickly found the keys and removed David's restraints. David rubbed his wrists and nodded his thanks but continued his phone conversation. Brennan approached Morrison, who looked like he was about to throw up. "Tell me exactly what happened out there." Morrison's story came out in fragments. He'd followed David because he looked suspicious. He'd smelled marijuana, which David denied. He'd searched the car and found cocaine under the seat. "Where did the cocaine come from, Morrison?" Brennan asked quietly. Morrison looked up with desperate eyes. "I found it under his seat, Chief, just like I said in my report." But Brennan had been a cop for 30 years. He knew when someone was lying, and Morrison's story had holes you could drive a truck through. More importantly, Brennan knew Morrison had been under pressure to make arrests, and he'd heard rumors about other questionable stops. David finished his calls and walked over to where Chief Brennan was standing. Despite everything that had happened, he maintained his professional composure. "Chief Brennan, I presume?" "Yes, sir, Director Johnson. I want to apologize for what happened here today." "This is completely unacceptable." David nodded. "I appreciate that, Chief, but right now, we need to focus on preserving evidence and protecting the integrity of the investigation that's about to begin." Within the hour, FBI agents from Atlanta began arriving at the Pine Valley Police Department. They came in unmarked cars and wore business suits, but their purpose was clear to everyone in the building. The small-town police station was now the center of a federal investigation. Special Agent Karen Mitchell was the first to arrive. She'd worked internal affairs cases for 8 years and knew how to handle sensitive situations involving law enforcement misconduct. She immediately took charge of securing evidence and interviewing witnesses. "I need to speak with Officer Morrison," Mitchell announced. Morrison was escorted to an interview room, where Mitchell read him his rights. The confident officer who had made the arrest a few hours earlier was now a suspect in a federal crime. "Officer Morrison, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened during your interaction with Director Johnson." Morrison's story began to fall apart under Mitchell's careful questioning. She asked for specific details about the traffic stop, the search, and the discovery of the drugs. Morrison's answers were inconsistent and evasive. "Officer Morrison, where exactly under the seat did you find the cocaine?" It was pushed back pretty far, like someone was trying to hide it." "How far back? Could you show me with your hands?" Morrison demonstrated, but his gestures didn't match what he'd written in his initial report. Mitchell continued her questioning, while other agents interviewed every person who had been in the police station during David's arrest. They collected security camera footage from the building and requested Morrison's body camera video from the traffic stop. The body camera footage was the most damning evidence. It showed Morrison's movements during the search, including the moment when he positioned his body to block the camera's view of the car's interior. The footage also captured Morrison palming something small before approaching the vehicle, though the object wasn't clearly visible. Meanwhile, David was giving his own statement to federal investigators. He described the traffic stop in detail, from Morrison's initial approach to the moment the drugs were discovered. His account was precise and professional, exactly what you'd expect from someone with decades of law enforcement experience. "Director, did you see Officer Morrison place anything in your vehicle?" Agent Mitchell asked. "I couldn't see into the car from where I was standing," David replied, "but I observed his body language and positioning during the search. His movements were consistent with someone who was concealing their actions." As the investigation continued, other cases involving Morrison began to surface. Agent Mitchell requested files on all of Morrison's arrests over the past 2 years, looking for patterns of suspicious evidence discovery. What she found was alarming. Morrison had an unusually high rate of finding drugs during traffic stops, especially compared to other officers in his department. In several cases, the drugs were found in locations that seemed designed to suggest the suspect was trying to hide them. The investigation expanded to include Morrison's training records, his financial situation, and his communications with other officers. Federal prosecutors were already preparing charges that could result in decades in prison. Chief Brennan watched his department fall under federal scrutiny and realized that Morrison's actions had exposed problems that went beyond one corrupt officer. The department's oversight procedures, training programs, and supervision methods would all be examined by federal investigators. For Morrison, the reality of his situation was becoming clear. He'd planted drugs in the FBI director's car, and there was evidence to prove it. His law enforcement career was over, and his freedom was in jeopardy. The pressure to make arrests that had driven him to corruption had ultimately destroyed everything he'd worked for. 6 months after his arrest of FBI Director David Johnson, former Officer Brad Morrison sat in a federal courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles. The confident police officer who had pulled over an expensive sedan on a quiet Georgia road no longer existed. In his place sat a broken man who had watched his entire life crumble as the consequences of his actions became clear. The federal courthouse in Atlanta was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and civil rights activists who had followed the case closely. Morrison's trial had become a symbol of police corruption and accountability, drawing national attention to issues that many communities had been fighting for years. U.S. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez stood before the jury to deliver her closing arguments. She had prosecuted dozens of corruption cases throughout her career, but this one felt particularly important because of its visibility and implications. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rodriguez began, "the evidence in this case is clear and undeniable. Brad Morrison planted drugs in an innocent man's vehicle and then arrested him on false charges. This wasn't a mistake or an error in judgment. This was a deliberate criminal act that violated the most basic principles of law enforcement." Morrison's defense attorney had argued that his client was under pressure to make arrests and had made a poor decision in a moment of desperation. But the evidence against Morrison was overwhelming. The body camera footage, witness testimony, and forensic analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. Morrison had deliberately planted evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Morrison was found guilty on all charges: deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and perjury. The maximum sentence he faced was 25 years in federal prison. Judge Patricia Williams, a respected federal judge with 30 years of experience, delivered Morrison's sentence 3 weeks later. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. "Mr. Morrison, you wore a badge and swore an oath to protect and serve your community. Instead, you chose to abuse the power that was entrusted to you. Your actions didn't just harm Director Johnson. They damaged the trust that communities place in law enforcement officers everywhere." Morrison received 18 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected the seriousness of his crimes and sent a clear message about the consequences of police corruption. But Morrison's case was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The FBI's investigation into his arrest patterns had uncovered a systematic problem within the Pine Valley Police Department. Over the course of 18 months, federal investigators identified 14 other cases where Morrison had likely planted evidence or filed false reports. The victims of Morrison's corruption were a diverse group: a single mother driving home from work, a college student visiting friends, an elderly man returning from a medical appointment. What they all had in common was that they were African American, and Morrison had targeted them based on racial profiling and prejudice. One by one, these wrongful convictions were overturned. People who had spent months or years in prison for crimes they didn't commit were finally vindicated. The legal process was complicated and slow, but federal prosecutors worked tirelessly to right the wrongs that Morrison had created. Angela Thompson had been one of Morrison's earliest victims. She'd been arrested 3 years earlier on drug possession charges after Morrison claimed to find crack cocaine in her purse during a traffic stop. Angela had maintained her innocence throughout her trial, and during the 8 months she spent in prison, but no one had believed her. When federal investigators reviewed her case, they found the same patterns they'd seen in Morrison's arrest of Director Johnson. The body camera footage showed suspicious movements, and the evidence didn't match Morrison's written report. Angela's conviction was overturned, and she received a settlement of $400,000 for her wrongful imprisonment. "I knew I was innocent," Angela said at a press conference after her exoneration. "But who was going to believe me over a police officer? It took the FBI director getting arrested the same way for anyone to listen." The Pine Valley Police Department underwent a complete transformation following the Morrison scandal. Chief Brennan retired early, taking responsibility for the failure of oversight that had allowed Morrison's corruption to continue unchecked. The federal government imposed a consent decree on the department, requiring extensive reforms to training, supervision, and accountability procedures. All officers in the department were required to undergo additional training on constitutional rights, proper search procedures, and ethical conduct. Body cameras became mandatory for all traffic stops, and the footage was regularly reviewed by federal monitors. New protocols were established for evidence handling and report writing. Director Johnson used the Morrison incident as a catalyst for nationwide police reform efforts. He testified before Congress about the need for better oversight of local law enforcement agencies and stronger federal intervention in cases of systematic civil rights violations. "What happened to me in Pine Valley could have happened to anyone," Johnson told the House Judiciary Committee. "The only difference was that I had the resources and authority to fight back. Most victims of police corruption don't have those advantages." Johnson worked with civil rights organizations and police reform advocates to develop new training programs for law enforcement agencies across the country. The curriculum focused on eliminating racial bias, respecting constitutional rights, and building trust between police and the communities they serve. The Morrison case also led to changes in how federal agencies monitor local police departments. The Department of Justice expanded its pattern and practice investigations, looking for signs of systematic civil rights violations in departments across the country. More resources were dedicated to prosecuting police misconduct cases, and new protocols were established for investigating complaints against officers. For Morrison himself, prison life was a harsh adjustment from his former status as a police officer. He was housed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and his former profession. Fellow inmates and correctional officers alike knew who he was and what he'd done. Morrison's wife divorced him 6 months after his conviction, taking their 2 young children and moving to another state. His pension was revoked, and he lost his house when he could no longer make mortgage payments. The confident officer who had thought he could manipulate the system had lost everything. In rare interviews from prison, Morrison expressed remorse for his actions, though many questioned whether his regret was genuine or simply an attempt to reduce his sentence. He claimed that pressure from supervisors and a department culture that emphasized arrest numbers had pushed him toward corruption. "I'm not trying to make excuses," Morrison said in one interview. "What I did was wrong and I deserve to be punished. But I want people to understand that police departments need to change how they measure success. When officers are judged only by how many arrests they make, some of them will do whatever it takes to meet those numbers." The Morrison case became a teaching tool in police academies across the country. Recruits learned about the consequences of corruption and the importance of maintaining ethical standards even under pressure. The case was also studied in law schools and criminal justice programs as an example of how systematic problems in policing could lead to individual acts of misconduct. Director Johnson continued to serve as FBI director for several more years before retiring to write and speak about criminal justice reform. He often reflected on the irony that his arrest in Pine Valley, while traumatic at the time, had ultimately led to positive changes in law enforcement practices. The town of Pine Valley slowly rebuilt its reputation following the Morrison scandal. The new police chief, brought in from outside the department, worked hard to restore community trust and implement the reforms required by the federal consent decree. Crime rates remained low, and citizen complaints against police dropped significantly. Morrison's case served as a reminder that corruption could happen anywhere, in any department regardless of size or location. It also demonstrated that accountability was possible when federal authorities were willing to intervene and communities were willing to demand change. The victims of Morrison's corruption, while vindicated, continued to deal with the lasting effects of their wrongful arrests and convictions. Many struggled with trust issues and financial problems caused by their time in prison, but their courage in coming forward helped expose a pattern of abuse that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Years later, the Morrison case remained a powerful example of how one corrupt officer's actions could impact an entire community and spark nationwide reforms. It proved that no one, regardless of their position or authority, was above the law when they chose to abuse their power.